serial murderer, rapist, and necrophiliac Ted Bundy confessed to murdering 30 women in the 1970s, but other experts think he killed over 100. He got 3 death sentences for murdering 2 Florida State University Chi Omega sorority sisters and a 12-year-old child after being apprehended for good in February 1978. Bundy's pleasant looks made him a celebrity throughout his trial, and his tale has inspired countless serial killer books and movies. He was 42 when hanged in January 1989. Theodore Robert Bundy was born in Burlington, Vermont, on November 24, 1946. His illegitimate birth shamed his mother's devout parents. Louise Cowell, 22, gave birth to Ted in an unwed mother's home. Cowell later took her kid to Philadelphia to her parents. Ted's birth certificate says his father is unknown, meaning his birth father may never be identified. There are several ideas concerning his identity. Ted's colleague and The Stranger Beside Me author Ann Rule says Lloyd Marshall, an Air Force veteran and Penn State graduate, was his father. Others suggest Ted's father is Jack Worthington, who may have been his grandpa. Bundy was raised as his grandparents' adopted son and told his mother was their sister to mask his illegitimacy. Cowell married Johnny Bundy in 1951 after moving to Tacoma with her son. Ted accepted his name but didn't respect his stepfather, whom he looked down on for being ignorant and working class. Johnny and Louise have many kids. Bundy seems to have been raised in a happy working-class home. He had a unique early fascination in the macabre. Knives attracted him at 3. Bundy was quiet, yet smart, doing well at school, but not with his friends. According to Iowa State University criminologist Matt DeLisi, who wrote Ted Bundy and the Unsolved Murder Epidemic in 2023, Bundy allegedly picked apart mice in the woods and tried to drown swimmers and boaters. He had no remorse, guilt, embarrassment, or shame. He had a darker side as a teenager. Bundy enjoyed peering through windows and snatching what he desired. The University of Washington awarded Bundy a psychology degree in 1972. He attended Utah Law School, but never graduated. Bundy fell in love with Diane Edwards, an affluent, beautiful California girl, while at the University of Washington. She had his dream: money, status, and influence. Their separation hurt him. Bundy's subsequent victims were gorgeous, long-haired students like his college lover. From the mid-1970s, Bundy became increasingly confident and involved in politics and society. After his campaign, the Republican governor of Washington sent him a letter of support. Bundy admitted to killing 30 women in multiple states in the 1970s, but experts suspect the number was more. Bundy confessed before his death after years of denial. "It all felt like a ploy to extend his life," said veteran FBI agent Bill Hagmaier, who spent time with the assassin following his capture. After raping his victims, he beat them to death. Bundy regularly called ladies into his automobile by claiming to be hurt and needing aid. Their generosity was deadly. When Bundy began murdering is disputed. Most accounts place his murdering spree around 1974. Many Seattle and Oregon women disappeared about this period. The victims were reportedly spotted with Ted, a young, dark-haired male. In a 2023 book, criminologist Matt DeLisi claims Bundy killed over 100 people and began in youth. Bundy drops a lot of clues that there were way more murders, DeLisi said, adding that investigators were unprepared to pursue Bundy. And the pacing and confidence with which he kills between 1974 and 1978 suggests he couldn't have started. The precise number of women Bundy murdered is unknown. Perhaps Bundy's most famous lover, Elizabeth Klopfer, helped authorities apprehend the serial murderer. He and Klopfer dated for 6 years after meeting at a Seattle pub in 1969. Single mother of a small kid, she fought with drinking. She stated Bundy was warm and loving. Klopfer suspected Bundy in 1974. He used his charm to deflect her questions about unusual practices like having a butcher cleaver in his desk. Klopfer covertly reported Bundy's participation in significant local killings to the police, but they didn't believe him. Though they stayed together, Bundy's departure to Olympia the next year strained relations. Klupfer returned to authorities in 1975 with evidence that helped catch the serial murderer. Bundy told Klupfer over the phone from his jail cell that he had attempted to murder her and couldn't resist when he felt his sickness building in him, she later wrote. After leaving Bundy, she published a book about her ordeal. After Bundy traveled to Utah for law school in September 1974, women disappeared there too. The next year, cops stopped him. A crowbar, face mask, rope, and handcuffs were found in his car. He was detained for having these tools, and authorities started investigating him for more serious offenses. Bundy was arrested in 1975 for kidnapping Carol Duranch, one of his rare escapees. A 1 to 15-year term followed his conviction. Bundy twice escaped jail in 1977. The first time, he was indicted for murdering a young Colorado lady and represented himself. He initially escaped by jumping out a window at the courtroom library. He was arrested 8 days later. Another Bundy escape occurred in December. After dropping almost 30 pounds to squeeze through a hole he created in his cell ceiling, he climbed out. Police didn't find Bundy for 15 hours, giving the serial murderer an advantage. Bundy reached Tallahassee after his second jail breakout. Bundy broke into Florida State University's Chi Omega sorority home on January 14, 1978. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy were slain by him after he assaulted 4 young women. Bundy abducted and killed 12-year-old Kimberly Leach on February 9th. He was arrested later that month after these killings, ending his murdering spree. Bundy's bite marks on Levy's corpse were the strongest evidence linking him to the 2 FSU Chi Omega killings. Ted Bundy was implicated when his mother, Louise, was a University of Puget Sound secretary. After he confessed, she believed the claims after years of denial. During his trial, Bundy was famous for his beauty, charisma, and brilliance. He fought for his life, but was convicted and executed twice for murdering Bowman and Levy in July 1979. He appealed his death sentence for 9 years. Bundy received another death sentence for Leach's murder in 1980. His 1989 electric chair execution was due to this sentence. Bundy appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, but was denied. He provided information on unsolved murders to avoid the death penalty, but he couldn't delay punishment forever. Bundy married Carol Ann Boone, a mother of 2 he dated before his imprisonment, in February 1980. They married in court during his penalty trial. He proposed and she accepted in front of the court, validating the Florida marriage. While working at Olympia's Department of Emergency Services, the couple met 6 years earlier. In 1982, Boone had Rose and named Bundy her father. Because Bundy couldn't have conjugal visits in jail, his paternity was questioned. However, Ted's former colleague Ann Rule, who authored a book about him, believes Bundy bribed the jail guards to allow the pair have sex. Boone ultimately found Bundy guilty. According to Rule's book, she divorced him in 1986 and relocated to Washington with her kid. Not much is known about Rose, also known as Rosa, today. It's thought Boone altered both of their identities to help them remain out of the public glare. Rule has stated she purposefully excluded anything about Boone or Rose because they deserve their privacy. I don't want to know where they are. I never want to be caught off guard by some reporter's question about them, Rule said on her website. All I know is that Ted's daughter has grown up to be a fine young woman. On January 24, 1989, Bundy was executed about 7 a.m. at a Florida state prison in an electric chair, colloquially known as Old Sparky. Outside the jail, spectators rejoiced and even fired off fireworks following Bundy's death. Some brought frying pans they beat on in joy and screamed, "Burn, Bundy, burn." According to the Los Angeles Times, evangelical broadcaster James Dobson interviewed Bundy the night before his death. He said Bundy cried and apologized. Bundy called his mother twice and ate steak, eggs, hash browns, and toast before his execution. Bundy's last words were to his lawyer, Jim Coleman, and pastor Fred Lawrence. "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends," Bundy said before his death. Scientists examined Bundy's brain after his execution for physical anomalies that may have caused his violence, but none were found. No public ceremony was conducted for Bundy's cremation in Gainesville, Florida. He asked his ashes be dispersed in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, where he killed at least 4 people before his execution. Zac Efron as Bundy and Lily Collins as girlfriend Elizabeth Klopfer premiered Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile at Sundance in 2019. A Netflix film, the title originates from Judge Edward Cowart's post-sentencing statements to Bundy. Efron felt obligated to make the film a psychological study of Bundy, rather than a celebration. Some reviewers said the film and Efron idealized Bundy. Also in 2019, Netflix released Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes. The short docuseries includes Bundy's death row tapes and current interviews. Author Stephen Michaud and journalist Hugh Ainsworth used over 150 hours of Bundy interviews to write a book. Ted Bundy, American Boogeyman, starring Chad Michael Murray, was released in 2021. No Man of God, based on 1980s FBI analyst Bill Hagmaier, chats with Bundy, starred Luke Kirby that year. Perhaps Bundy's most famous lover, Elizabeth Klopfer, helped authorities apprehend the serial murderer. He and Klopfer dated for 6 years after meeting at a Seattle pub in 1969. Single mother of a small kid, she fought with drinking. She stated Bundy was warm and loving. Klopfer suspected Bundy in 1974. He used his charm to deflect her questions about unusual practices, like having a butcher cleaver in his desk. Klopfer covertly reported Bundy's participation in significant local killings to the police, but they didn't believe him. Though they stayed together, Bundy's departure to Olympia the next year strained relations. Klopfer returned to authorities in 1975 with evidence that helped catch the serial murderer. Bundy told Klopfer over the phone from his jail cell that he had attempted to murder her and couldn't resist when he felt his sickness building in him, she later wrote. After leaving Bundy, she published a book about her ordeal. After Bundy traveled to Utah for law school in September 1974, women disappeared there too. The next year, cops stopped him. A crowbar, face mask, rope, and handcuffs were found in his car. He was detained for having these tools, and authorities started investigating him for more serious offenses. Bundy was arrested in 1975 for kidnapping Carol Durant, one of his rare escapees. A 1 to 15-year term followed his conviction. Bundy twice escaped jail in 1977. The first time, he was indicted for murdering a young Colorado lady and represented himself. He initially escaped by jumping out a window at the courtroom library. He was arrested 8 days later. Another Bundy escape occurred in December. After dropping almost 30 pounds to squeeze through a hole he created in his cell ceiling, he climbed out. Police didn't find Bundy for 15 hours, giving the serial murderer an advantage. Bundy reached Tallahassee after his second jail breakout. Bundy broke into Florida State University's Chi Omega sorority home on January 14, 1978. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy were slain by him after he assaulted 4 young women. Bundy abducted and killed 12-year-old Kimberly Leach on February 9th. He was arrested later that month after these killings, ending his murdering spree. Bundy's bite marks on Levy's corpse were the strongest evidence linking him to the 2 FSU Chi Omega killings. Ted Bundy was implicated when his mother, Louise, was a University of Puget Sound secretary. After he confessed, she believed the claims after years of denial. During his trial, Bundy was famous for his beauty, charisma, and brilliance. He fought for his life, but was convicted and executed twice for murdering Bowman and Levy in July 1979. He appealed his death sentence for 9 years. Bundy received another death sentence for Leach's murder in 1980. His 1989 electric chair execution was due to this sentence. Bundy appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, but was denied. He provided information on unsolved murders to avoid the death penalty, but he couldn't delay punishment forever. Bundy married Carol Ann Boone, a mother of 2 he dated before his imprisonment, in February 1980. They married in court during his penalty trial. He proposed, and she accepted in front of the court, validating the Florida marriage. While working at Olympia's Department of Emergency Services, the couple met 6 years earlier. In 1982, Boone had Rose and named Bundy her father. Because Bundy couldn't have conjugal visits in jail, his paternity was questioned. However, Ted's former colleague Ann Rule, who authored a book about him, believes Bundy bribed the jail guards to allow the pair have sex. Boone ultimately found Bundy guilty. According to Rule's book, she divorced him in 1986 and relocated to Washington with her kid. Not much is known about Rose, also known as Rosa, today. It's thought Boone altered both of their identities to help them remain out of the public glare. Rule has stated she purposefully excluded anything about Boone or Rose because they deserve their privacy. "I don't want to know where they are. I never want to be caught off guard by some reporter's question about them," Rule said on her website. "All I know is that Ted's daughter has grown up to be a fine young woman." On January 24, 1989, Bundy was executed about 7 a.m. at a Florida state prison in an electric chair, colloquially known as Old Sparky. Outside the jail, spectators rejoiced and even fired off fireworks following Bundy's death. Some brought frying pans they beat on in joy and screamed, "Burn, Bundy, burn." According to the Los Angeles Times, evangelical broadcaster James Dobson interviewed Bundy the night before his death. He said Bundy cried and apologized. Bundy called his mother twice and ate steak, eggs, hash browns, and toast before his execution. Bundy's last words were to his lawyer, Jim Coleman, and pastor, Fred Lawrence. "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends," Bundy said before his death. Scientists examined Bundy's brain after his execution for physical anomalies that may have caused his violence, but none were found. No public ceremony was conducted for Bundy's cremation in Gainesville, Florida. He asked his ashes be dispersed in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, where he killed at least 4 people before his execution. Zac Efron as Bundy and Lily Collins as girlfriend Elizabeth Klopfer premiered Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile at Sundance in 2019. A Netflix film, the title originates from Judge Edward Cowart's post-sentencing statements to Bundy. Efron felt obligated to make the film a psychological study of Bundy rather than a celebration. Some reviewers said the film and Efron idealized Bundy. Also in 2019, Netflix released Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes. The short docuseries includes Bundy's death row tapes and current interviews. Author Stephen Michaud and journalist Hugh Ainsworth used over 150 hours of Bundy interviews to write a book. Ted Bundy, American Boogeyman, starring Chad Michael Murray, was released in 2021. No Man of God, based on 1980s FBI analyst Bill Hagmaier chats with Bundy, starred Luke Kirby that year. Fear crippled New Orleans by August 1918. In the middle of the night, the Axeman of New Orleans attacked Italian grocery store owners and their families. He injured several and killed 4. The assaults were brutal. Joseph Maggio broke his head with an axe and sliced his neck with a razor. When his wife Catherine had her neck slit, she asphyxiated on her own blood. The Axeman was also suspected of other deadly assaults on non-Italians. New Orleans residents were frightened. Italian immigrants were particularly terrified, with panicked men staying up all night to protect their families, media said. New Orleans Police Superintendent Frank Mooney believed the killer was a murderous degenerate fond of blood. The Axeman hit New Orleans homes from 1917 until March 1919. The murderer then crossed the Mississippi River to Gretna. His usual attack on Charlie Cordemelia on March 9 severely injured Charlie and his wife Rosie and killed their 2-year-old daughter. Mooney blamed their degenerate. However, Gretna Police Chief Peter Leeson and Sheriff Luis Marrero identified the Cordemelia's next-door neighbors, elderly Orlando Giordano and his 17-year-old son Frank, as the perpetrators. They were grocers who had sued the Cordemelias over a commercial disagreement. A problem was that no evidence accused Giordano's. The authorities harassed the wounded Cordemelias at Charity Hospital, demanding, "Who hit you? Was it Giordano's? Frank did it, right?" Rosie constantly denied knowing who assaulted her, according to her doctor. Marrero quickly detained Rosie as a material witness, and imprisoned her in Gretna once she recovered. Her freedom was contingent on signing an affidavit incriminating her neighbors. Orlando and Frank were tried for their life on Rosie's identification, which even her doctor doubted. In less than a week, they were both convicted of murder. Orlando, 69, was given life in jail. Frank was hanged. 9 months later, Rosie came into the Times-Picayune and recanted. She stated St. Joseph urged her to reveal the truth in a dream. Rosie filed another declaration, claiming she hadn't seen her assailants, and was persuaded to name the Giordanos. Despite Rosie's recantation, the prosecution persisted. Rosie was threatened with perjury if she changed her tale. However, Orlando and Frank were released in December 1920. Why did Gretna officials think neighbors, against whom there was no proof, were the killers? Why did they disregard the New Orleans police chief's warning that a violent devil was targeting Italian grocers? Italians were in the Crescent City before the Civil War, and an Italian commercial community existed. The late 19th century need for a cheap workforce drove a large influx of Sicilians into the state and city, including Orlando Giordano, Americanized from Guagliardo, who came from Sicily to Louisiana. Post-emancipation, Louisiana sugar planters appreciated Sicilian workers, who were described as hard-working, money-saving, and satisfied with limited amenities. Sicilians dominated Italian immigration into Louisiana in the 1880s and 1890s, arriving in New Orleans at over 80%. Some remained. New Orleans had the biggest Italian population in the South by 1900, with 20,000 residents, including children of immigrants. Most departed to work on sugar cane and cotton plantations, a hard existence that allowed them to save money. An immigrant who saved his income may start his own business in a few years. The planters' only issue with Italian labor was this. In 2 years, Italians would have laid by a little money and are ready to start a fruit shop or grocery store at some crossroads town, planters complained. Small Italian-owned enterprises popped up over Louisiana by 1900. Sicilian immigrants' business success couldn't shelter them from Southern racism. In Louisiana, Italians worked alongside black laborers in the fields. Italians, unaware of Southern racial hierarchy, accepted this, while local whites saw it as no different from Negroes, Chinese, or other non-white groups. Many called the dark Sicilians black Dagos. Contemporary observers noticed that even African American laborers distinguished between whites and Italians and treated their co-workers with a sometimes contemptuous, sometimes friendly, first-name familiarity they would never have employed with other whites. The 1870s and 1880s prejudice against Italian immigrants was fueled by the belief that Dagos were no better than Negroes. Lynch mobs and distrust plagued them. A 1929 New Orleans judge described most Sicilians as of a thoroughly undesirable character, being largely composed of the most vicious, ignorant, degraded, and filthy paupers, with something more than an admixture of the criminal element. The French Quarter, New Orleans' oldest area with dilapidated Creole homes, became Italian. In the early 20th century, so many Sicilians lived in the lower French Quarter along the river that Jackson Square to Esplanade Avenue, between Decatur and Chartres, was called Little Palermo. In New Orleans and elsewhere, enterprising Sicilians often worked their way up from plantation laborer to truck farmer, peddler, and grocer. Italians took over corner groceries by the early 20th century. They owned just 7% of New Orleans food establishments in 1880. By 1920, Italians controlled half of the city's supermarkets, up from 19% in 1900. Joseph Vaccaro sold fruit from a mule-drawn cart in New Orleans after working on sugarcane farms. He started his wholesale company with a fruit booth in the New Orleans French market and earned millions importing oranges and bananas. Before launching Progresso Food Products, Giuseppe Udo sold olive oil and cheese from a horse-drawn cart. Despite triumphs, Italian immigrants were stereotyped, some of which were true. Sicilians brought clannishness and mistrust of government to America. Thus, they settled disagreements via vendettas. This court system continued in Sicily until the 20th century. Immigrants transferred it to New Orleans, where personal and professional vendettas were rampant. So many gunshots and knife battles happened on Decatur Street. It was called Vendetta Alley. Immigrant crime dread peaked in 1890 to 1891 with the assassination of New Orleans Police Chief David Hennessy. The night of October 15, 1890, the popular official returned home to shotgun fire. Deathly wounded, Hennessy said, "The Dagos got me." He was engaged in a violent conflict between the Provenzanos and Matrangas. The enmity and organized Italian criminal groups known as the Mafia were simple for New Orleanians to link to Hennessy's murder. Two groups of Sicilians were detained by police for trial. A crowd stormed the prison and killed 11 defendants after first acquittals. They lynched acquitted and untried defendants. Criminal Italian gangs were active in New Orleans, but crime historian Humbert S. Nelly says they could not accurately be ascribed to mafiosi. According to historian Robert M. Lombardo, the Mafia was not a secret criminal organization, but a form of social organization that developed in Sicily and the south of Italy under very specific circumstances. He says it was a form of behavior and a kind of power, not a formal organization. However, Black Hand crime, a practice, not an organization, threatened victims with violence if they didn't pay. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw such crime in southern Italian communities across the U.S., including New Orleans. It only stopped when immigrants' descendants became Americanized enough to complain to the police. The vendetta, the mafia, and the Black Hand were often confused by New Orleans residents in the early 20th century, who used both terms to refer to a formal criminal organization. Considering this history, New Orleanians suspected the attacks on Italian grocers were related to a vendetta or Black Hand blackmail. New Orleans investigator John D'Antonio, a nationally recognized mafia specialist, disputed the concept, stating a Black Hand assault wouldn't have left survivors like the Axeman did. Like New Orleans Police Superintendent Frank Mooney, he believed the assaults were committed by a fiend, a Jekyll and Hyde personality like Jack the Ripper. He suddenly feels compelled to murder and must comply. Basically, a serial murderer. Mooney and D'Antonio disagreed, but Gretna officials were more likely to accept a grudge between two Italian companies than a frenzied fiend stalking the streets when the Axeman assaulted the Cordemilius. Even some New Orleans police believed the vendetta could explain the Axeman murders. Gretna authorities were also familiar enough with Sicilian immigrants' Old World practices to fabricate evidence against their obvious suspects. This misuse of authority is unjustified. They are not responsible for their ignorance about serial murderers, a new notion. And believing an Italian revenge wasn't altogether unreasonable at an era when conflicts among Italian immigrants not occasionally ended in violence or murder. A detailed review of the attacks ascribed to the Axeman demonstrates that not all of these assaults were indeed his workmanship, but someone was specifically targeting Italian grocers, both in 1917 to 1919 and in 1910 to 1911, when a similar spate of attacks occurred. According to eyewitness accounts of survivors, the Axeman was a white working-class male in his 30s when the attacks began. From the ease with which he broke into the groceries and his use of a railroad shoepin, a common burglary tool, the police concluded that he was an experienced burglar. The Axeman vanished from New Orleans after the attack on the Cordemilius. The murder of Mike Pepitone in August 1919, while sometimes attributed to the Axeman, actually appears to have been part of a long-standing vendetta. He killed Joseph Sparrow and his daughter in Alexandria in December 1920, Giovanni Orlando in DeRidder in January 1921, and Frank Scalisi in Lake Charles in April 1921, according to police and press reporting. The murderer broke into an Italian shop at night and attacked the merchant and his family with their own axe. The Axeman vanished. Neither did New Orleans Italians. Their success continued. As supermarkets expanded, corner stores faded, but they, like many immigrants before them, integrated into American culture while retaining their ethnicity. Russian mystic and faith healer Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin. Befriending the imperial family of Nicholas II, the last Russian emperor, gave him significant influence in the closing years of the empire. Rasputin was born to peasants in Pokrovskoye, a Siberian hamlet in Tyumensky Uyezd, Tobolsk Governorate, now Yarkovsky District, Tyumen Oblast. After a journey to a monastery in 1897, he became a monk or stranik, but he had no formal Russian Orthodox Church post. He visited St. Petersburg in 1903 or 1904, 1905, enthralling religious and social elites and becoming a notable Russian figure. Rasputin met Nicholas II and Alexandra Fyodorovna in November 1905. Rasputin started healing Nicholas and Alexandra's only son, Alexei Nikolaevich, who had hemophilia, in late 1906. Some Russians saw him as a mystic, clairvoyant, and prophet, while others saw him as a religious fraud. When Nicholas departed St. Petersburg to lead the Imperial Russian Army in World War I in 1915, Rasputin's authority peaked. Without him, Rasputin and Alexandra strengthened their power over Russia. Both characters grew more unpopular as Russian military failures on the Eastern Front increased, and in the early hours of the 30th of December, conservative Russian noblemen who disliked Rasputin's influence over the royal family killed him in 1916. Siberia heard of Rasputin's charm and activities in the early 1900s. In 1904 or 1905, he went to Kazan and became known as a knowledgeable starets who could aid people with spiritual issues. Despite claims that Rasputin had sex with female followers, local religious authorities liked him. Archimandrite Andrei and Bishop Christianos sent Rasputin a letter of reference to Bishop Sergei, the rector of the Alexander Nevsky Monastery's theological school, and arranged for him to fly to St. Petersburg. Rasputin met religious authorities in the Alexander Nevsky Lavra, including Archimandrite Theophan, theological school inspector, and imperial family confessor. Theophan was well connected in St. Petersburg society. Theophan was so fascinated by Rasputin that he asked him to remain in his house and became one of his closest friends in St. Petersburg, allowing him to attend many of the local aristocracy's religious salons. Rasputin gained early and important adherents via these sessions, many of whom would ultimately turn against him. St. Petersburg's aristocracy were fascinated by the occult and supernatural, and spiritualism and theosophy were popular before Rasputin's arrival. According to Furman, the city's elite were bored, cynical, and seeking new experiences, and were fascinated by Rasputin's strange manners and views. A group of nobles, led by Prince Felix Yusupov, the husband of the Tsar's niece, and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, Nicholas's first cousin, lured Rasputin to Yusupov Palace on December 29, 1916, out of fear of his growing power and his suspected plot to make a separate peace with the Germans. First, Rasputin's assailants handed him cyanide-laced food and drink. After failing to respond to the poison, they shot him at close range, killing him. After reviving, Rasputin tried to flee the palace grounds, but his attackers shot and battered him again. Rasputin, amazingly alive, was chained and thrown into a frigid river. The major conspirators, Yusupov and Pavlovich, were deported once his corpse was found some days later. The imperial government collapsed soon after the Bolshevik Revolution. The Romanovs' long, gloomy rule ended with Nicholas and Alexandra's murder. Harris was a journalist who was 23 years old in the early 1960s when he went to the Nuevo Leon State Jail in Monterrey, Mexico, to write on an American called Dykes Askew Simmons, who had been convicted of murder. This information was disclosed by Harris in the foreword to the 25th anniversary edition of the Silence of the Lambs book, which was published in 2013. Simmons, with his unsettling eyes and bad Z-plasty repairing a cleft lip, clearly suited the description of a murderer. Yet, Harris found himself more captivated by the physician who had treated the American after he had survived a failed attempt to escape from jail. When Harris first saw Dr. Salazar at the medical office of the correctional facility, he referred to him as a small, lithe man with dark red hair and said that he had a certain elegance about him. The physician came to life after the reporter provided a few replies that were unremarkable. He then proceeded to inquire about Simmons's scarred look and asked for his opinions. "Did the people who were murdered stand out to you?" So Salazar inquired. In response, Harris said, "Yes." Should we take the doctor's statement to mean that the stunning victims were the ones who provoked Simmons into a violent rage? The response from the physician was, "Certainly not." Early anguish, on the other hand, makes later agony easier to fathom. "Mr. Harris, you are a journalist," he said. "I recognize you. How would you go about writing it down in your journal? When writing in journalese, how do you deal with the dread of agony? If you had to remark anything witty about the suffering, would you say something like, 'It puts the hell in hello'?" Later on that day, Harris was taken aback when he discovered that Dr. Salazar was not, according to his first assumption, a prison staff, but rather a convicted individual who was facing a long sentence in jail. It was the warden who informed him that the physician was a killer. Because he was a surgeon, he was able to wrap his victim in a box that was astonishingly tiny. He is not going to leave this location, ever. He is really mad. As per the profiles published in the Times of the United Kingdom and the Latin Times, it has been revealed that the individual referred to as Salazar, in Harris's narrative, was really known by the name Alfredo Bali Trevino. He was born in Mendez, Tamaulipas, to a family that was well known in the community. As a result of his father's strictness, the youngster and his siblings were encouraged to achieve academic success. When Bali Trevino was a medical intern in 1959, he found himself in a disagreement with his sweetheart, Jesus Castillo Rangel. The reason for this disagreement might be either financial difficulties or his own determination on marrying a lady. The man who wanted to become a physician murdered his partner, then meticulously cut him up into bits so that they could fit into a box. He then tried to bury the box on a ranch. Despite the fact that his work was quickly discovered, Bali Trevino was ultimately condemned to death in 1961 for his crime of passion that he committed. Another charge that was made against him was that he was a suspect in the murder and dismemberment of hitchhikers. However, it seems that these allegations were never confirmed. It has been said that the werewolf of Nuevo León continued to exhibit a sophisticated sense of style when he was incarcerated by wearing light-colored suits, dark sunglasses, and a gold Rolex watch. In addition to this, he kept up an unofficial medical practice by providing medical care to other inmates and by visiting residents of the town. After serving a term of 20 years in prison, Bali Trevino was released and was able to return to his former neighborhood in Monterrey, where he provided medical assistance to the ill and the impoverished, sometimes at no cost. In 2008, a few months before he passed away from prostate cancer, he consented to give an interview to a newspaper. However, he declined to discuss his violent history, stating, "I don't want to wake up my ghosts." Forensic experts have identified Jack the Ripper, the London serial murderer who haunted the streets over a century ago. Aaron Kosminski, a 23-year-old Polish barber and key police suspect, was identified by genetic testing this week. However, detractors argue that the evidence is insufficient to conclude this case. A soiled silk shawl recovered close to the mangled remains of Catherine Edowis, the killer's fourth victim, in 1888 was forensically examined. According to reports, the shawl has blood and killer semen. 4 more London women were slain in a 3-month rampage, but the perpetrator remains unknown. Kosminski has been tied to crimes before. However, this is the first peer-reviewed publication of the DNA evidence. Biochemist Jari Luolainen of Liverpool John Moores University in the UK performed the first genetic testing on shawl samples some years ago, but he wanted to wait until the controversy subsided before submitting the findings. In naming Jack the Ripper, 2014, Russell Edwards, who acquired the shawl in 2007 and provided it to Luolainen, utilized the unpublished test findings to identify Kosminski as the killer. However, geneticists noted that insufficient technical data regarding the study of DNA material from the shawl made it difficult to evaluate the claims. The new study outlines them somewhat. In the most systematic and most advanced genetic analysis to date regarding the Jack the Ripper murders, Luolainen and his colleague David Miller, a reproduction and sperm expert at Leeds University, extract and amplify the shawl's DNA. The testing matched mitochondrial DNA fragments from the shawl to those from Edowes and Kosminski's surviving relatives. The Journal of Forensic Sciences concludes that Kosminski's DNA matches a living relative. The study reveals the murderer had brown hair and eyes, supporting eyewitness testimony. These characteristics are surely not unique, the paper's authors concede. The experts say blue eyes are becoming more frequent than brown in England. The outcomes may disappoint critics. The research lacks specifics on the genetic variations detected and compared between DNA samples. Instead, the writers use colorful boxes to illustrate them. They believe the shawl and current DNA sequences matched where the boxes overlap. According to their study, the Data Protection Act, a UK legislation protecting privacy, prevents them from disclosing Edowes and Kosminski's live relatives' DNA sequences. The paper's visual is simpler for non-scientists, particularly those interested in true crime. A forensic scientist at the Institute of Legal Medicine at Innsbruck Medical University in Austria, Walter Parson, argues mitochondrial DNA sequences pose no privacy danger and should have been disclosed in the publication. Otherwise, the reader cannot evaluate the outcome. I wonder where science and research will go if we provide colorful boxes instead of outcomes. Innsbruck mitochondrial DNA specialist Hansi Weissensteiner also disputes the study, which can only prove that two DNA samples are unrelated. Based on mitochondrial DNA, one can only exclude a suspect. The shawl's mitochondrial DNA may have originated from Kosminski or thousands other Londoners at the time. Critics of the Kosminski hypothesis say there's no proof the shawl was at the murder site. They think it may have contaminated over time. These DNA tests are not the first to identify Jack the Ripper. U.S. crime novelist Patricia Cornwell invited experts to examine DNA from serial murderer letters to police some years ago. She identified the murderer as Walter Sickert, a painter, based on DNA research and other facts, although many experts think the letters were phony. Another DNA study of the letters suggested a female killer. American cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., John Wilkes Booth murdered Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president, on April 14, 1865. Lincoln died the next day at 7:22 a.m. in the Peterson House opposite the theater, after being shot in the head while watching the performance. First U.S. president killed. A long national sorrow followed his funeral and burial. Lincoln's murder was part of Booth's political scheme to resurrect the Confederate cause by removing the three most powerful federal officials toward the conclusion of the Civil War. The conspirators Lewis Powell and David Harold killed Secretary of State William H. Seward, while George Atzerodt killed Vice President Andrew Johnson. The scheme collapsed after Lincoln's death. Seward was injured, and Johnson's assailant went intoxicated instead of murdering him. After a daring escape, Booth was slain after a 12-day pursuit. Powell, Harold, Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt were executed for conspiracy. Despite Booth's previous news, Grant and Julia Grant refused to join the Lincolns since Mary Lincoln and Julia Grant were not friends. After many rejections, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, daughter of New York Senator Ira Harris, accepted the Lincolns' offer. Mary had a headache and wanted to remain home, but Lincoln informed her he had to go since newspapers had reported his attendance. Although Lincoln's bodyguard William H. Crook encouraged him not to attend, Lincoln stated he had promised his wife. Lincoln informed Speaker Schuyler Colfax, "I suppose it's time to go, though I would rather stay," before helping Mary into the carriage. The presidential party arrived late and settled inside their box, two neighboring boxes with a barrier removed. During the play's break, the orchestra performed "Hail to the Chief" as 1,700 people applauded. Lincoln sat on a Ford family-selected rocking rocker. To commemorate Lincoln, the cast changed the phrase, "Well, you're not the only one that wants to escape the draft," to, "The draft has already been stopped by order of the president," when the heroine begged for a draft-free seat. A spectator noted that Mary Lincoln regularly brought her husband's attention to stage activity and seemed to take great pleasure in witnessing his enjoyment. Mary murmured to Lincoln, who was clutching her hand, "What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" Lincoln said, "She won't consider it." Later, these statements were deemed Lincoln's final, however family friend N.W. Minor said in 1882, that Mary Lincoln informed him Lincoln's last words indicated a desire to see Jerusalem. Lincoln's normal precautions were absent at Ford's that night. Crook was working a second shift in the White House, while Lincoln's bodyguard, Ward Hill Layman, was in Richmond on duty. John Frederick Parker guarded the presidential box. He, Lincoln's valet Charles Forbes, and coachman Francis Burke proceeded to a local bar for intermission. Booth had many beers while waiting before his appointment. Parker may have returned to the theater, but he was not at his station when Booth entered the box. A star like Booth may have been let in. Booth braced the door after entering the box, expecting a guard. Booth returned to Ford's Theater around 10:10 p.m. via the front door after leaving the pub. Showing Charles Forbes his calling card, he entered the dress circle and headed to the presidential box. Navy surgeon George Brainerd Todd watched Booth come. Booth wedged a stick between the hallway door and wall to block it. Another entrance led to Lincoln's box. Evidence reveals Booth poked a peephole in this second door earlier in the day. Booth was familiar with the play Our American Cousin and timed his shot at 10:15 p.m. to match Harry Hawk's laughing at one of the lines. "Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal. You sock-dologizing old man-trap." Booth unlocked the door, walked forward, and shot Lincoln from behind as he laughed at the statement. After breaking both orbital plates, the bullet entered Lincoln's skull behind his left ear, went through his brain, and rested toward the front. Lincoln collapsed and fell backward on his chair. Booth was fewer than 4 feet behind Lincoln when Rathbone turned. Booth dropped the revolver and stabbed Rathbone in the left forearm with a knife as Rathbone leaped from his seat. Rathbone seized Booth again as he prepared to leap 12 feet from the box to the stage, 50. Booth fell awkwardly on his left foot when his riding spur got caught on the box's treasury flag. Some audience members assumed he was in the performance when he crossed the stage. The mob blocked Charles Leal, a young Union Army physician, from opening the presidential box door until Rathbone, within, noticed and removed Booth's wooden brace. Lincoln was sitting with his head to his right while Mary cried and embraced him. His eyes were closed, and he was in a profoundly comatose condition, while his breathing was intermittent and exceedingly stertorous. Leal lowered Lincoln, thinking he was stabbed. Charles Sabin Taft, another doctor, was hauled into the box from the stage. Leal spotted the bullet wound behind Lincoln's left ear after he and spectator William Kent took away his collar while unbuttoning his coat and shirt and found no stab wound. Although the bullet was too deep to remove, removing a blood clot helped Lincoln's breathing. He discovered that constantly removing new clots preserved his breathing. Leal let Laura Keene hold Lincoln's head on her lap after artificially respirating him. He declared the wound fatal. Leal, Taft, and another doctor, Albert King, concluded Lincoln should be relocated to the closest 10th Street residence, since a carriage journey to the White residence was too perilous. 7 men carefully lifted Lincoln out of the auditorium, where an irate throng had gathered. They decided to take Lincoln to one of the homes across from Peter Taltavul's Star Saloon. Soldiers dragged Lincoln onto the street, where a man directed them to Taylor William Peterson's home. It was pouring. The tall Lincoln lay diagonally on a little bed in Peterson's first-floor bedroom. After evacuating the room, including Mrs. Lincoln, the physicians removed Lincoln's garments but found no more wounds. As Lincoln was chilly, they used hot water bottles, mustard plasters, and blankets. More doctors arrived: Surgeon General Joseph K. Barnes, Charles Henry Crane, Anderson Ruffin Abbott, and Robert K. Stone. All agreed Lincoln wouldn't last. Barnes found the bullet and bone pieces in the wound. They removed blood clots to reduce head pressure throughout the night, and Leal clutched the unconscious president's hand tightly to let him realize he was human and had a friend. Lincoln's elder son, Robert Todd Lincoln, arrived around 11 p.m., but 12-year-old Tad Lincoln, who was seeing Aladdin at Grover's Theater when he heard, was kept away. Navy Secretary Gideon Welles and War Secretary Edwin M. Stanton arrived. After forcing the crying Mrs. Lincoln out of the sick room, Stanton operated the U.S. government from the mansion for the rest of the night, including the search for Booth and the conspirators. Guards kept the public out, but officials and doctors were allowed to pay their respects. Lincoln started with serene features and steady respiration. Later, one eye swelled and his right cheek darkened. In a letter to the New York Times, Monsell Bradhurst Field said Lincoln began breathing consistently, although with difficulty, and did not appear to be struggling or suffering. Lincoln's look became perfectly natural, save for eye deterioration, as he approached death. Mary returned to Lincoln's side before 7 a.m., and Dixon said, she again seated herself by the president, kissing him and calling him every endearing name. On April 15th, Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. After Lincoln's murder in 1865, the White House ghost is supposed to haunt the White House. Springfield's Lincoln Law Office and other old houses are claimed to be haunted. Lincoln's ghost is one of the most renowned White House ghost tales. Citation required Grace Coolidge, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, Winston Churchill, and Theodore Roosevelt reportedly witnessed Lincoln's spirit at the White House. Lincoln's ghost is the White House's most renowned. In 1927, First Lady Grace Coolidge encountered Lincoln's ghost at a yellow oval room window looking out over the Potomac. Possibly the most famous incidents occurred in 1942 when Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands heard footsteps outside her White House chamber and answered a tap on the door to see Lincoln in frock coat and top hat. Winston Churchill liked to retire late, take a hot bath with scotch, and smoke a cigar. He reportedly got out of the water and entered the neighboring bedroom nude, save for his cigar. He was surprised to find Lincoln resting on the mantel beside the fireplace. Churchill, always quick to respond, pulled his cigar out of his mouth, tapped the ash off the end, and replied, "Good evening, Mr. President. You appear to disfavor me." Lincoln smiled gently, chuckling, and vanished. Theodore Roosevelt, Maureen Reagan, Dennis C. Revelle, and other Franklin D. Roosevelt administration staff members claim to have encountered Lincoln's ghost. Roosevelt's valet once rushed screaming from the White House, claiming to have seen Lincoln's ghost. Though she never saw Lincoln's spirit, Eleanor Roosevelt said she sensed him throughout the White House. She also said that Fala, the Roosevelt household dog, would bark at Lincoln's spirit without cause. Lady Bird Johnson's press secretary Liz Carpenter and President Dwight D. Eisenhower's press secretary James Haggerty reported they often sensed Lincoln's presence. The passageway outside the Lincoln bedroom apparently hears the former president's footsteps. Lillian Rogers Parks said in her 1961 memoirs, My 30 Years Backstairs in the White House, that she heard them. When she stayed in the Lincoln bedroom, Margaret Truman, daughter of President Harry S. Truman, heard a spirit pounding at the door and thought it was Lincoln. President Truman was woken by door raps while sleeping in the Lincoln bedroom. Several unidentified eyewitnesses have claimed to have seen Abraham Lincoln's shadow laying down on the bed in the Lincoln bedroom, which was utilized as a conference room during his administration, while others have seen him sit on the bed and put his boots on. The most famous eyewitness was Eleanor Roosevelt's assistant, Mary Eben, who witnessed Lincoln put on his boots and rushed screaming from the room. Some say Lincoln's ghost was spotted outside the White House. Lincoln was claimed to haunt a Loudonville, New York, residence owned by a lady who was in Ford's Theater when Booth murdered Lincoln. Other Lincoln hauntings included his cemetery in Springfield, Illinois, a painting of Mary Todd Lincoln, and a ghost train on April evenings following the same route his burial train took from Washington, D.C. to Springfield. Lincoln's ghost was last seen in the early 1980s by White House operations foreman Tony Savoy, who saw Lincoln seated in a chair at the top of the steps. Charles Manson led the Manson family in a deadly spree. The mob brutally murdered pregnant actress Sharon Tate and other Hollywood residents. Manson got the death penalty in 1971, which was reduced to life in prison in 1972. Approximately 35 killings are attributed to him. Manson died naturally in jail in 2017, after his 83rd birthday. Charles Mills Maddox, aka Charles Manson, was born in Cincinnati on November 12, 1934, to Kathleen Maddox, a 16-year-old sex worker with drug addiction concerns. Kathleen married William Manson, but the marriage failed shortly, and Charles was put in a boys' school aged 12. After being rejected by his mother, Charles ended himself homeless and doing small crimes. Manson was caught and imprisoned in 1951 as a youngster. He spent half of his first 32 years in prison. Manson alternated between foster homes and reform schools while not in prison. He was dangerous until discovering the rewards of being a model prisoner. Probation records portrayed Manson, who was just 5 feet 2 inches tall, as having a marked degree of rejection, instability, and psychic trauma, and constantly striving for status and securing some kind of love. Other descriptors were unpredictable and safe only under supervision. Pimping, automobile theft, and check fraud were his crimes. For breaking probation, he was sent to McNeil Island Jail in Washington State for 10 years in 1961. Manson learnt guitar and music reading in prison. He was freed from jail and relocated to San Francisco on March 21, 1967. He became a hippie cult leader, leading the Manson family. He lived with 23-year-old Berkeley library worker Mary Brunner, his first disciple, before adding teenage runaway Lynette Fromme. The Manson family cult included at least 35 verified adherents, mostly vulnerable females. They shared Manson's unusual lifestyle and LSD and magic mushroom usage. The family moved from San Francisco to a remote San Fernando Valley property in 1967. When a tiny, hardcore group came to embrace Manson's claims that he was Jesus and his racial war predictions, the commune changed. Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys picked up 2 hitchhiking family members before Manson's murder spree. He hosted Manson and other family members at his house. This connection allowed Manson, a musician, to audition for Terry Melcher, the son of Doris Day, a Beach Boys friend and producer. Director Roman Polanski housed Melcher. The producer declined to work with Manson. Manson supposedly recorded songs in Dennis's brother Brian Wilson's home studio. Manson wrote Cease to Exist, renamed Never Learn Not to Love, which the Beach Boys released as a B-side on their 1969 album, 2020ths. Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys picked up 2 hitchhiking family members before Manson's murder spree. He hosted Manson and other family members at his house. This connection allowed Manson, a musician, to audition for Terry Melcher, the son of Doris Day, a Beach Boys friend and producer. Director Roman Polanski housed Melcher. The producer declined to work with Manson. Manson supposedly recorded songs in Dennis's brother Brian Wilson's home studio. Manson wrote Cease to Exist, renamed Never Learn Not to Love, which the Beach Boys released as a B-side on their 1969 album, 2020ths. Manson and his young, faithful followers likely committed 35 killings, but most of their cases were never prosecuted due to lack of evidence. After brutally murdering 7 people, including actress Sharon Tate and rich supermarket businessman Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary, on 2 nights in August 1969, the principal culprits were sentenced to life in prison. On August 9, 1969, Manson and his followers massacred Hollywood's elite and beautiful people. At 10050 Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon, north of Beverly Hills, Roman Polanski's leased house was where Manson's first victim was slain. Polanski was in London filming, and 4 victims were assaulted after returning home after supper. Manson sent 4 of his most devoted followers, Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, to the address, and ordered them to murder everyone. One family member said that the Polanski family was targeted because it symbolized the entertainment industry that rejected Manson. Stephen Parent was the Manson family's first victim while visiting a friend. He was shot and killed by intruders as he drove out from the residence in the dark early morning. Kasabian stayed outside to observe the 18-year-old's shooting, appalled. Kasabian was the getaway driver and was the main trial witness. After breaking into the home, the other three tied up Sharon Tate, Wojciech Frykowski, Abigail Folger, and Jay Sebring in the living room. Sebring was shot and savagely stomped while defending 8-month pregnant Tate. Frykowski and Folger fled the home during the horrifying assault, but were hunted and stabbed to death. Kasabian testified that she was frightened when she saw Frykowski staggered out of the home covered in blood. Although she said she was sorry, her assailant continued to bash her. Folger fled the home with horrible injuries, but was captured on the front yard and stabbed 28 times. Tate, married to Polanski, begged for her unborn child's life. Atkins brutally stabbed her stomach. Atkins told Tate, "Look, bitch, I have no mercy for you," before stabbing her. "You'll die, so prepare." Tate's blood was used to write "pig" on the front door by Atkins. He blamed the murders for sloppiness rather than pathological Manson. The next night, Manson brought Watson, Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten to Leno and Rosemary LaBianca's Los Feliz home and killed them in a similar manner. Interestingly, Manson and his family were caught for vandalizing Death Valley National Park while hiding in the Mojave Desert, not for the Tate LaBianca murders. The county sheriff arrested them in 1969 without knowing they committed the terrible killings. Susan Atkins's confession, while in custody for murdering Gary Hinman in an unrelated incident, convinced authorities that Manson and his followers were responsible. Various reasons were evaluated throughout the study. Most likely was that Manson's pathological ego, psychosis, and Armageddon belief caused his devastation. He claimed he was the new Messiah, and that concealing in the desert would preserve him and his followers after a nuclear attack. According to his prophetic visions, the race conflict would end in a black triumph, forcing Manson and his followers to teach the black community, which would lack the expertise to rule the world. Manson instructed his followers to start the racial war because he and his family would benefit. Defense witness and killer Leslie Van Houten said this was the main reason they killed the LaBiancas. Manson stole Rosemary LaBianca's wallet to put it in a Los Angeles neighborhood where a black person may discover it, use it, and be accused of the murders. Van Houten, who was 19 when she participated in the LaBianca murders, said in court that Manson had used her fragility and disdain for her mother, albeit she felt, like the other members, that he was a visionary. Van Houten told a parole board hearing 30 years later that she was shocked by her actions that night and wanted to rehabilitate herself. In first admissions to other convicts, Susan Atkins said she planned to cut out Tate's unborn baby but didn't have time. She also said that additional high-profile Hollywood actors were intended to be slain and tortured. Frank Sinatra, Steve McQueen, Tom Jones, and Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton were examples. Atkins said the Manson family planned to shock the public and get attention by killing celebrities. The Manson and Van Houten trial started in June 1970, with Ronald Hughes as their counsel. Hughes abandoned Manson as a client because he believed he could prove Van Houten was inspired by the cult leader. The maneuver may have killed him. Hughes vanished while camping later that year. His decomposing corpse was found months later. He may have been killed by the Manson family in revenge. Manson published the CD Lie to fund his defense. He enjoyed the media attention and appeared in court with an X on his forehead. After shaving their heads, several of his female followers sat outside the courtroom. X was eventually transformed into a swastika. The murderers laughed and grimaced with Manson throughout the trial, displaying no remorse. On January 25, 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree murder for ordering the Tate LaBianca homicides. His death sentence was reduced to life in prison when California's Supreme Court overturned all death sentences before 1972. Corcoran State Prison in California held him for 40 years. 2 more death sentences were remitted to life in prison: Atkins and Van Houten. Since 1969, Atkins remained in prison until her 2009 death. Van Houten was freed from jail in July 2023 after almost 50 years following many parole hearings. Kasabian's star witness testimony earned her amnesty. Manson married 17-year-old hospital server Rosalie Jean Willis in 1955 between jail stints. The couple traveled to California and produced a son, Charles Manson Jr., who became Jay White and committed himself in the 1990s. Willis left Manson with their kid in 1956 to be with her new boyfriend and divorced him 2 years later. In 1959, Manson married sex worker Leona Ray Candy Stevens, his second wife. He produced a second son, Charles Luther Manson, with Stevens, who became J. Charles Warner over a decade later. Warner died in 2007 after Stevens divorced him in 1963. Manson and his first cult member, Mary Brunner, had Michael Brunner, his third kid, in 1968. The Manson family killings occurred when he was 14 months old. His maternal grandparents adopted him. In November 2013, Afton Burton, posing as Star, told Rolling Stone, "I'll tell you straight up, Charlie and I are going to get married. The date is unknown. However, I take it seriously. Charlie's my spouse. Charlie instructed me to inform you." Star relocated from Illinois to Corcoran, California, aged 19 to be near Manson's jail, and created various websites to free him. Star, 26, and Manson, 80, acquired a marriage license in November 2014. They lost their license in 2015, and writer Daniel Simone said in February that Star wanted to marry Manson to publicly exhibit his body for profit. Star told Inside Edition in February 2015 that the wedding was still happening, but her mother disagreed. They never married. Manson died naturally on November 19, 2017. His offenses landed the 83-year-old in jail for almost 46 years. Manson had been hospitalized in Bakersfield, California, days previously. For privacy and security, his medical condition and whereabouts were not divulged. The long-term prisoner was ill earlier this year. Stores faded, but they, like many immigrants before them, integrated into American culture while retaining their ethnicity. The actual tale of Candyman, while facing the horrible daily reality of poverty, police neglect, and narcotics that had afflicted Black Chicagoans for decades. Candyman is an urban legend. The character's eerie appearance and terrible past have captivated horror lovers for years. From racial hatred in America to a Chicago woman's gruesome murder, Candyman's actual tale is more sad and scary than the movie. This film was partly shot in Chicago's Cabrini Green housing complex on the near North Side. Cabrini Green, like the Abla houses where Ruth McCoy lived and died, housed thousands of Black Americans who migrated to Chicago for employment and to escape the Jim Crow South during the Great Migration. The contemporary apartments included gas stoves, indoor plumbing and baths, hot water, and temperature control to help inhabitants survive Lake Michigan winters. The residences were featured in Good Times as an example of a respectable lifestyle, fulfilling this early promise. However, prejudice and Chicago Housing Authority neglect turned Cabrini Green into a nightmare. In the 1990s, 15,000 African Americans lived in decaying apartments with poverty and drug-related violence in plain view of Sears Tower. During his 1890 picture of a white lady, brilliant Black artist Daniel Robitaille fell in love and impregnated her. After discovering him, her father hires a gang to beat him, cut off his hand, and hook him. They then doused him with honey and let bees kill him. Death transformed him into Candyman. Helen Lyle may be Candyman's white lover reincarnated. This element of the narrative is disturbing, since interracial couples, and Black males in particular, were at jeopardy throughout U.S. history. Timing is crucial. Black neighbors were increasingly lynched by white mobs in the late 19th century. Lynch mobs killed 40 Blacks in 1880. By 1890, when the Candyman tale began, that number had more than quadrupled to 85. And those were only the reported homicides. Everyone suffered this violence. In 1911, a white mob in Chicago harassed champion boxer Jack Johnson after he married a white lady. William Bell, 33, was Cook County's sole documented lynching victim, beaten to death in 1924 because the dead man was suspected of having attempted to attack one of two white girls, but neither girl could identify Bell as the assailant. The Candyman's dread is a mirror of years of African Americans' everyday lynching, which made it so horrifying. Before the 1967 Supreme Court ruling, Loving v. Virginia legalized interracial relationships, hundreds of African Americans had been attacked and murdered nationwide. Lynching became a federal criminal in February 2020 when the House enacted a measure. Candyman brilliantly blends myths, folklore, and urban legends with the genuine terrors of Black life in the U.S. to create a new horror icon.